Great. So I thought today, because I've been around for a little while, that I might give a sort of overview of a few decades worth of work and try and sort of integrate and tell a bit of a story. So I hope I don't go on too long and I'm necessarily going to leave out a lot of things because there's limited time. And I'm going to focus mostly on things that's come out of my lab, but I'll try to integrate into sort of a larger picture. So just to begin with, this is like preaching to the choir to this group, but rhythms are fundamental organizing principles of perception and action. We find them everywhere. So, even a jellyfish with very few neurons executes rhythmic movement. Another example of someone without very many neurons who can execute rhythmic movement. And of course, we use rhythm in auditory and movement and other systems in very complex ways as humans. So today I'm going to focus on early development. And actually, the world of the infant is very rhythmic as well. So interactions between caregivers and infants are exquisitely coordinated in time, sometimes with turn taking, sometimes with synchrony across different systems, movements, gaze, and physiological responses. And there's evidence that these affect the quality of these interactions affect the infant's development. So when we talk to infants, we use musical speech and we sing to infants in different styles. And so infants are getting a lot of this rhythmic input early in development. And I'll just play you a couple of examples of different styles of singing to infants. And you'll see that rhythmically they're just really distinct. So here's one.
Ooh ee ooh ah ah, ting tang, walla walla bing bang. Ooh ee ooh ah ah.
Yeah, so that's obviously like a lullaby style. The caregiver is trying to soothe the baby. We did a study where we asked caregivers to sing the same song in two different caretaking situations, and here's the other one.
Ooh ee ooh ah ah, ting tang, walla walla bing bang. Ooh ee ooh ah ah, ting tang, walla walla.
So they're completely different. Adults are 100% correct at telling which one is the lullaby and which one is the play song. They differ in tempo and so on, but also in articulation and rhythmic qualities. So right from the beginning, infants are getting important information through the timing and the rhythmic qualities of their interactions. So again, I don't have to dwell on this in this group at all, but why are rhythms so powerful? Well, there's many reasons. One is they help us organize the incoming information into chunking and phrasing. Also, their regularity allows us to engage in predicting what's going to happen next and putting our attention at important places in the upcoming stream. And just to sort of as a really quick review, people have actually been studying rhythm perception in infants for a very long time. So you can see here there's studies from Sandra Treehab and Demaney and others going back to 1977, showing that infants, these were typically around 6 to 8 month olds, can discriminate different rhythmic patterns. Quite a few studies showing that infants perceive phrase boundaries in both speech and music. And also that newborns discriminate languages with different rhythmic structures. And so they've already become somewhat familiar before they're born with whether their language is stress timed or syllable timed. And we can measure that. That has been measured since 1998 in newborn infants. Something else that I think is really worth just sort of pointing out at the beginning is that all of the major developmental disorders have all been associated with timing and or rhythmic deficits. So that includes dyslexia, ADHD, autism, stuttering, developmental coordination disorder. I'll talk about the latter a little bit later. But again, it just emphasizes the importance of rhythm in early development. And if something goes wrong in the perception and processing of rhythm and timing, it can have serious consequences on development. Okay, so this is the plan for my talk. Three parts. The first part, I'll talk about the development of neural rhythm tracking. The second part, I'll talk about early embodiment and sort of auditory-motor interactions for rhythm. And so, as you all know, infants are not very coordinated. They can't easily coordinate movements with auditory rhythms, but I'll show that these interactions are already there really early in development. And then finally, I'll hopefully have time to talk about the role of rhythm in social interactions. I see I have that twice. I don't know why. Okay, so to start from the first one, development of neural rhythm tracking. So usually we've done this using EEG measures. And so one of the questions that we asked early on was, does the infant brain track the beat, and does it track the metrical structure in rhythms? And we've often used this rhythm, so I'll just sort of go over it because it's going to come back again and again in the talk, which is kind of like a warning to younger scientists that be careful of the stimuli you choose because you tend to use them over and over to compare to what you did before. So probably we should spend more time thinking through the stimuli that we chose. Anyway, this is the one that we chose. So it's beat, rest, beat, 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 rest. So it's a repeating 6-beat pattern. This is the beat level. It's an interesting stimulus because it's ambiguous. You can hear it either as 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 in a duple frequency, or you can hear it in groups of 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we've done it with different timbres and tempos and so on, but this is basically what it sounds like. So 1, 2, 1. Okay, so we presented this rhythm to babies, and this, if you analyze the frequency content of this rhythm, you'll find a peak at the beat frequency, in this case 1.5 hertz, the triple frequency 1 hertz, and the duple frequency, beat frequency 3 hertz, the duple frequency 1.5 hertz, and the triple frequency 1 hertz. So we measure babies' heads and distract them and get the net on them. And then present, in this case, this study from 2016 was done when Laura Sorelli was a grad student in my lab. And when we analyze the EEG from infants listening to this rhythm, we see clear peaks at the frequencies that are prominent in the stimulus. So this is telling us that infants' brains appear to be tracking the incoming frequency information in the stimulus. So these were actually 7-month-olds. Interestingly, we also looked doing correlational analyses on musical experience. And at 7 months, infants that were in music classes in the purple or no music classes in the green showed very similar responses at the beat frequency. But when you looked at the grouping frequencies, we saw larger responses in the infants that were in musical classes for infants and parents. So we don't know if this was caused by the musical classes or caused by those parents having more experience at home of music for the infants or some genetic component. But already early in development, we can see these differentiations between these individual differences in infants' responses. Okay, so then more recently, through collaboration with the group in Amiens in France, that's led by Sahar Mogimi, and this particular study was led by Mohammad Reza Edaladi. We looked at premature infant brains, so how early in development, and sort of remember it's sort of the end of the second trimester-ish, when we think that infants start to actually have sound information getting to cortex. So in this case, we looked at premature infants around 30 to 30 weeks gestation, so soon after they were born. And we presented them this same rhythm that I described that has these prominent peaks at the beat, the duple, and the triple frequencies. And so they were presented to them in the incubator in the neonatal intensive care unit. In this case, we presented also a second rhythm, and this one is in quadruple meter, so it was a 12-beat pattern. Uh, so groups of four, or the beat frequency occurring 4 times in every group of four. And so these were the results. So yes, even in these premature infants, we already see in their EEG frequency peaks at those beat and meter frequencies in both of these rhythms. So this was pretty amazing. I remember when Sahar approached me about doing this, and I kind of said, I don't think you'll get it. There won't be anything at that age. But in fact, it's there quite robust, quite robustly. Um, so then we decided to look, well, can we look even earlier? So in this case, we presented just the first rhythm, comparing infants now who are as young as 28 weeks and dividing into two groups, 28 to 32 weeks gestation, 33 to 36 weeks gestation. And again, the 6-beat pattern. In this case, we presented different blocks and different timbres just to see about generalization. We presented at a few different frequencies or pitches. And so in this case, we were interested in looking at stimulus to brain synchronization. So how well could the brain really track the incoming temporal structure? So to do this, we created sine wave representations that had peaks at the beat onsets or the onsets of the duple or onsets of the triple timing. And then we narrowband filtered the EEG at those frequencies of interest. And we calculated the phase time series for each of the stimuli and the EEG frequencies and used a synchronization index to look at phase differences between the stimulus and the EEG for each of these frequencies. So that's sort of very briefly, the method. And so we're interested in this stimulus brain synchronization and how it might change over gestation. So for the beat, you can see, so this is age along here, and you can see from 28 to 36 weeks, there's an increase in this coupling strength. So in fact, over this period, the brain appears to be getting better at this neural tracking. Similarly, for the 2-meter frequencies, you can see, you can see also that there's an increase in the coupling strength between the brain and the stimulus with gestational age. And if we look basically at where things are significant, if we look at the beat frequency, and we have a surrogate distribution sample here to give us our chance level. The lighter bar here is the performance in the infants, the younger group, and this is the performance in infants in the older group. And they're both above chance levels. So this is telling us even as young as 28 to 32 weeks, the brain is tracking the beat frequency. However, for the meter frequencies, we are only getting significant effects for the older age. So both ages are tracking the beat, but the stimulus brain coupling gets stronger in the older premature infants. For the meters, in the study, we were only able to detect significant neural tracking for the older infants. But this was quite astonishing to me that even at these very, if you think of how immature the brain is at this time, that these responses are already there. And it to me really suggests that the brain is organized for time from the beginning. And these abilities to track the incoming information is there as the brain is getting set up and is probably having a big influence on how the brain gets set up. So there's many other things that we can ask. I put in this as a really nice study from Thomas Lentz and Sylvie Nozeridan and their colleagues. And this is in newborns. And here they're starting to ask a little bit more sophisticated question than just can the brain track the regularities in the input. Because as we know, in many rhythms, there isn't a lot of energy at frequencies that we feel strongly and we would want to tap along to. So they compared, they had a rhythm that this top one, you can see my pointer, right? Yeah, okay. So this top rhythm, you can see that there's energy at the beat frequency, the duple frequency, and the quadruple frequency in the stimulus. And they passed it through a cochlear model, but I'm not going to go into that here. And then this is a weakly periodic rhythm. So in fact, in this rhythm, at the duple frequency, there's almost no energy. So we know in adults, when we do this in adults, their brains show energy at the duple frequency. So their brain is actually creating an internal model that has the duple frequency as an important frequency, but it's not there very much in the stimulus. And you can see infants are tracking again, but look at the duple frequency. Their brain is actually, these are newborns now, their brain is actually saying, oh, the duple frequency is something that I am encoding, even though it's not really physically there directly in the stimulus. Yeah, and then Erica Flayton in my lab, when she was a graduate student in my lab, so she's just started a postdoc with Janet Worker. We looked at whether infants could hold to give them an ambiguous stimulus and see whether they could actually maintain one or another of the possible representations of that ambiguous rhythm. So could we prime them to hear it one way or another and then see if they would maintain that perception subsequently? So our same rhythm, I told you I was going to present it a lot. So infants were either primed with accents on every second beat of this rhythm or on every third beat of this rhythm. And then in the test part, the accents were taken out, so they all heard exactly, regardless of how they were primed, they heard exactly the same thing. And in this case, we put pitch changes, these were quarter tone pitch changes, either on beat 4, which would be a strong beat if you were hearing it in groups of 3 in triple, or a pitch change on beat 5, which is a strong beat if you're hearing it in groups of 2. Okay, so the idea here then is that if you are perceiving this rhythm as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you should show a mismatch response in the EEG to this pitch change that's stronger here than here. And then opposite, if you're hearing this as 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, you should be more sensitive to a pitch change on this strong beat than this beat, which in your case would be weak. Okay, so that was the design. And here are the results. So you may not be familiar with these kinds of responses in infants, but the mismatch negativity that we see in adults, we can see it in young infants under some circumstances, around 4 months or so, and it gets stronger over time. But actually, infants, what we typically see at this age in response to something like a pitch change is a slow, positive, frontally positive wave. So those of you who study infants are probably quite familiar with this. We call it the mismatch response. It's a slow wave. It gradually disappears. We don't see it really at all in adults. And just as an aside for those interested in sort of various things that I've done, you can see both this response and the more adult-like mismatch response in certain age groups and for certain tasks. So I think that they are actually not generated. It's not like one is an immature sort of version of the other. But what does seem to be the case is that for both this infant mismatch response and the adult mismatch negativity, they occur under the same circumstances. So they occur when there's something that is occasionally changed in an ongoing stream. Okay, so in this case, we had these occasional pitch changes, and we're looking at the brain's response to these changes. Yeah, so what you can see in the top group, so this is the top graph here is the group that we primed on every second beat. And this is their mismatch response to beat 5. So they show a stronger response to pitch changes on that beat than they do to pitch changes on beat 4. And we get the opposite pattern for the infants who were primed to hear accents on every third beat. So remember, for these measurements, both groups are hearing exactly the same thing, but their brain responses are different. So that tells us that their internal representations of this rhythm are different, and we were able to bias them to hear the rhythm one way or the other, and they could maintain that particular internal representation for a period of time. So again, like the Lentz study, this is another indication that infants aren't just encoding the input, but they're interpreting it according to some internal structures or expectations that they have about how rhythms should be organized, and they can be biased to hear things one way or the other. Okay, so to summarize this part of the talk, as young as 28 weeks gestation, premature infants' brains automatically track beat frequencies in auditory patterns. But the neural coupling for beat and meter frequencies improves between 28 and 36 weeks gestational age. Infants at 6 months can hold a primed metrical interpretation. And infants can track beat frequencies not present in the stimulus that make sense for that particular rhythmic pattern. So the brain is really set up to track temporal structure and to impose internally generated metrical interpretations from the beginning, from as soon as auditory information is reaching cortex. Just as an aside, timing in speech and rhythm and music is typically not isochronous. And so I think, people are starting more in adults to start to try to cope with this. How do we look at, rhythms that are not regular? And in particular, many of the things that we hear musically are not isochronous, but they're also not random. So people make particular adjustments to timing related to content and what they're trying to convey. And so understanding how that works and how it develops, I think is a big challenge for us for the future. So you can just hear how the rhythm. Yeah, so despite that distortion, we know exactly where the beats are, right? There's no problem knowing what the metrical structure is. Okay, so the second part, moving on to that, it has to do with early embodiment. So these auditory-motor interactions for rhythm. So there are many models coming up now. I've just put one here by Cannon and Patel of how there are connections in the brain from auditory to premotor, supplementary motor areas for timing, and the idea that in fact in order to do rhythmic timing, it seems that we need to have the motor regions involved. So it's not just that the auditory information is going to motor regions, but there are these feedback loops that actually allow us to do timing. But if you think about infants, they're extremely motorically immature. Uh, and they don't, it's months before they can really move with volition. Um, so, how do we know what's going on in the infant brain? And so, many years ago, we were thinking about this problem and we thought, well, maybe the infants can't move themselves precisely in time to a beat, but we can move them. And in fact, infants are getting movement experience all the time because they're being carried by caregivers who are moving rhythmically. They're being rocked while being sung to, etc. So they're getting this experience all the time of correlated auditory and movement information, even though they can't necessarily generate it themselves. So this is actually the study that originated this 6-beat pattern that we use all the time. And so we asked whether infants could be primed to hear this ambiguous rhythm in either duple or in triple meter, depending on how they were bounced. Okay. So we could bounce them on every second beat, or we could bounce them on every third beat. And this was done by Jessica Phillips Silver. Actually, it's now 20 years ago, I guess, when she was. So there she's bouncing them on every third beat, and here on every second beat. So of course, in the real study, we had different infants in the two groups. The other thing, just as an aside, I'll say is this is the only study I think I've ever done where we didn't lose an infant for crying or being upset. They love to be bounced. They're happy after being bounced and willing to do your task for you. Yeah, so after that experience, now we played them that same rhythm, but without any accents. So again, all the infants heard this same ambiguous rhythm. And we gave them a preferential looking test. So a light would flash on this side, and when they looked, they got one of the two. They got, sorry, let me backtrack. They got one of the two rhythms. All the rhythms now had accents. During bouncing, they had no accents. So the categorization according to duple or triple was completely by movement. Here in the test, there's no movement, but the rhythms now have accents. So on one side, they would hear the rhythm accented every second beat, and then when they look to the other side, they would hear the rhythm accented on every third beat. And how long they listened on each side across the trials gave us a measure of their preference of looking. And so what we found was if they were bounced on duple, then they preferred to hear the rhythm with accents on every second beat. If they were bounced in triple, they preferred to hear the rhythm with accents on every third beat. So this tells us that at least at 7 months, there is already some connection between the auditory and motor systems. Visual information was not necessary. We ran a condition where they were blindfolded and got the same results. However, when we didn't actually move the infants and they just watched the experimenter moving, we didn't get the effect. So it had to have the infant moving. I'm not going to go into them, but we did some bunch of studies on trying to look at the vestibular system with Lawrence Harris. And this was just done in adults because I wasn't comfortable with infants, but by stimulating alternatively the two under the ear, the two sides, you can activate the vestibular nerves. And if you alternate, you sort of get the feeling that your head is moving even when it's not. And in adults, anyway, that's enough. Vestibular input is enough to bias them to hear the rhythm one way or the other afterwards. Okay, so like I said, many studies, seeing how I'm doing for time, many studies show that in adults show that music and speech rhythms activate premotor and sensory motor regions. Just one example from Takako Fujioka when she was a postdoc in my lab, looking at beta band. So we just presented isochronous rhythms at different tempos, and what you see is that the amplitude, the energy in the beta band, which is between these lines here, increases and decreases regularly at the tempo of the rhythm that we present. Um, Furthermore, it seems to be showing prediction because the slope of the rebound, the decrement, so the decrease in beta band after the onset of a tone is similar despite the tempo, but the rebound changes depending on the tempo, which suggests it's predictive. But the important thing here is that this beta band um, tracking, showing neural tracking of the rhythm, is found not only in auditory areas, but in supplementary motor areas and even cerebellum and some other areas related to movement. And it's out of phase, also out of phase between auditory areas and motor areas. So this is really suggesting that there's these auditory motor loops in adults. So then some very recent work that's still under revision, and again, this was done with Sagar Mokhimi's group in Amiens. We decided to look because we'd found all these other interesting things that premature infants were able to do. And we thought, what's the very early involvement, perhaps, of motor regions in rhythm processing? So this data has 13 infants, 36 weeks gestational age. We used sequences from Grand and Rowe, 2009, who showed activation with fMRI of motor areas to regular rhythmic sequences compared to irregular sequences. So here's an example of a regular pattern. So it's 4 beats, um, 4 beats and then 2 and 2, 1, 1, 2 is another group of 4, 3 and 1 is a group of 4. So it's a regular pattern in groups of 4. And then to make the irregular patterns, on 2/3 of the intervals, we randomly shortened or lengthened by 20, 25, or 33% the interval. Okay, so you can see here what some of that might look like. So it completely destroys any regularity in the sequences. I won't go into this, but it's just to show that we tried to match the regular and irregular as much as we could in every other way. Of course, the rhythmic had a frequency peak at the quadruple, the groups of 4 beats. And then we presented, one of the nice things about measuring premature infants is that we measure them when they're asleep and we can record for half an hour or so, which once they're born, we cannot do. So we can actually collect a fair bit of data from them. And then this just shows this is fMRI, sorry, FNIRS, if I didn't mention that already. And I have to really admire the group in Amiens because they have to manufacture all these things for these premature infants. You can't just go out and buy these things. So they have to make everything for these studies. So it's really an amazing group they have there. Okay, so just really briefly to look at the results. Where to start with this? Okay, so we found these significant clusters are what I'm going to sort of focus on here. So these were regions where we saw significant differences between rhythmic and the arrhythmic stimuli. But first, we just wanted to make sure that we had the typical, what we would expect pattern. So this is the oxygenated, deoxygenated measurements, and you can see we get the typical patterns in left and right that we would expect, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. this is the interesting part here. So we found um, in left premotor cluster and a right sensory motor cluster that you can sort of see here, where there were significant differences between the rhythmic and the arrhythmic. So the rhythmic is shown in the green and the arrhythmic in the red. So you can see this is for this cluster here. We also had a region of interest in the auditory area, and we actually didn't find a difference in the auditory area for these, the FNIRS response in these two areas. So this is all the oxygenated response. Similarly, in the right, it's in a bit of a different area, but we found the difference in this sensory motor area, but again, not in the auditory area. So again, to me, this is pretty amazing. It's showing really that there's a fundamental role for some of these premotor, sensory motor regions in auditory beat perception. So there's no movement here. We're just presenting the auditory beat in the premature brain long before the emergence of any overt movement, and when the brain is really quite immature. So those are those basic results. Yeah, so moving on, we then, well, this is actually studies that were done earlier, but just in general from our studies in infants, if the auditory and in adults, if the auditory system recruits the motor system for rhythmic processing, then sort of conversely, we might expect auditory time perception to be poor when the development of motor timing is poor. Okay, so we're kind of taking the argument a little bit in the reverse direction. And so with Andrew Chang, who was my graduate student at the time, we looked at developmental coordination disorder and asked the question, which had never really been asked before, do these children have an auditory timing deficit? Okay, so they have, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, they have significant fine or gross motor deficits, they're kind of the clumsy children. Sadly, we know they're at increased risk of behavioral, physical, and mental health problems because they have trouble interacting with other kids, especially in sports. There aren't a lot of neuroscientific studies, but we know they have motor timing deficits. There's also, interestingly, high comorbidity with ADHD and dyslexia, both of which have been associated with perceptual and motor timing deficits. So Andrew said, this is a great population. We should really study this population. And we found Dr. John Kearney, who was running a large study where he went into all the schools in Southern Ontario and was measuring a large number of children on a whole bunch of motor tasks to look at the prevalence and individual differences and so on, prevalence of DCD, developmental coordination disorder, and individual differences and so on. So we piggybacked on this study. I'm just going to zip over the sort of sample because I don't want to run out of time. But the basic tasks. So from this sample, we had a group of children who were identified as at risk for DCD. They didn't have a formal diagnosis, but they had all the signs of DCD, and a group of typically developing children. And so we gave them, these were behavioral tasks first, and then we did EEG after. So we gave them a duration discrimination task. These are all two alternative fourth choice. So which interval was shorter? A rhythm task where they had to say which interval had a rhythm that was off. And then as a control, a pitch discrimination task. So again, which interval had different pitches in it. And so just very briefly, we found there was children with DCD performed significantly worse on the duration and the rhythm tasks. Although, as you can see, there's a lot of individual differences, but not on the pitch. So we then looked at EEG measures. So for duration, sometimes the duration would change between a sequence. And what we found was a significant delay in the mismatch response to this in the children with DCD. So they still showed a response, but it was slower than in the typically developing children. To the rhythmic asynchrony, they again showed similar responses, except what we think is a P3A here, they're showing quite a delayed response compared to the typically developing. So this may be related to some kind of inefficient attentional processing in the children with DCD. For pitch, there was no difference in their mismatch responses. So, oh, I'm almost out of time. So we did a lot of studies on whether children could benefit from auditory motor interventions. And I'm just going to really zip over this. To show, so we gave them metronome tapping task, metronome continuation tapping, and musical excerpt tapping. So they had to just tap along to the metronome. They had to tap after the metronome went off, and they had to tap to a musical excerpt. And for performance consistency, there was a difference between the groups, but you can see it's not very large. So the DCD group is performing a little bit less consistency in their tapping in the metronome music and continuation conditions. And then we also found that all three groups did worse when there was no auditory cue. So in the metronome continuation task, all three groups did worse. So what that suggests is that both groups could benefit from auditory rhythmic cues. So now we're thinking about kinds of interventions that could be applied to children with developmental coordination disorder, because typically they only get motor tasks, but this is suggesting that actually they could benefit from auditory rhythmic cues. And we've also looked at their ability to do a simple dance step to an auditory to music in this case. That ice cold Michelle fight for that white gold. This one for them hood girls, them good girls, straight masterpieces. Yeah, so he's interesting because he does the dance step very well, but he's not in time. But I won't go through again all the analyses. But this is the important graph, which shows that actually, so again, the DCD are in the blue and the typically developing in the orange. And you can see that it's only at the slowest tempos that the children with DCD are performing worse. At the slower tempos, they're actually able to do this dance step quite well. So they do have a deficit, but it's not across the board, and so for all tempos. So this suggests that actually something like a dance intervention could be very beneficial in this age group. And I'm not going to get to, I guess, the role of rhythm in social interactions because I think we are probably out of time. So instead, I'm just going to jump to the end. And if anybody wants to ask questions about any of that, we have some new pilot data on visual attention to auditory rhythms and so on, which I don't have time to tell you about. And we're doing mother-infant interaction with dual eye trackers. So we're getting the infant and the mother eye tracker at the same time. Again, maybe I'll come back and talk about these other studies sometime, but don't have time today. We're looking at things like blinking, which turns out to be quite different in infants and adults, infant-directed and adult-directed. But the summary of that section is simply that infants use movement, synchrony, gaze, and blinking to navigate their social world. So all of these um, domains really involve synchrony and timing really importantly. Also, if you ever come to Hamilton, you should come and see the Live Lab, our research performance hall, which I wasn't going to have as part of the talk anyway. Yeah, and otherwise, I'll just say thank you to everyone in the group, in the research group at McMaster, and thanks for having me. Very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Laurel. That was super interesting, and we already have messages for requesting a second, maybe Zoom meeting, and we are happy to host that if you're free to from the September onwards to hear about these super interesting studies with dual eye tracking. Okay, let's see if there are questions or raised hands before we proceed. Let me quickly check. There is a hand, but I'm trying to pinpoint it. Oh.
Oh, I think Martin.
Yeah, it's Martin and Easton Winkler. I don't know who raised the hand first, but feel free to. Martin?
Okay. Hi, Laurel. Great talk. Um, one thing that I'm curious about is a lot of the stuff focuses on auditory mechanisms, which makes sense because we think of auditory as being the primary mode for rhythm. But do you know if there's anything linking in your work or other work to other modalities, say like visual processing, visual timing, tactile timing, say, it's like rhythms of tapping on the skin. I mean, certainly for music, we also perceive music, in a tactile way. Vision less so, but you can imagine that since the auditory system is so good at processing timing, maybe these other modalities that are a bit less good should benefit more from motor movements and motor rhythmic, um, um, bolstering. So is there anything that you can say about that in terms of development and what we see in children?
That's a great question, and I think that the tactile is probably really important. With Sahar, we did a pilot study in adults looking at if tactile could induce different meters. But if you think about the infant's experience, they're being held and they're being patted and they're getting this rich just when what they feel across the mother's skin or her clothing, they're getting that information. So and it's going to be correlated with the auditory rhythms. So I suspect it's really important. We know, there's this whole thing of kangaroo care for premature infants, which is the skin-to-skin contact. So early on, we know that is important. What hasn't been done so much is whether the temporal structure is important. And the other thing you asked was about vision. I didn't have time to show some of the studies we've started doing at the end, but there's this really interesting study that came out from Miriam Lenz's lab, 2022, I think it was, and she's continuing to do more work. And she played infants videos of people singing to them, so infant directed singing, and she tracked the eyes of the infant, and what she showed was at the strong beats of the singing, the strong beats of the song, infants were more likely to look at the eyes and less likely to look at the eyes in between. And so we've started following up. We've been in contact with her, and we started following up in different ways. We're now some of the research I wasn't able to show you at the end. We just have pilot data so far, but it looks like infants may also do this with speech. So infant-directed speech has very exaggerated rhythmic structure, and they may also do this with speech, although probably less robustly than with singing, because we're comparing speech and singing. So yeah, I think the auditory rhythms are probably also involved in their attentional
Hmm.
processes, right? So the auditory rhythms are telling them, oh, look at the eyes at this point.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
yeah, and we're also looking at in the dual eye tracking, we're looking at many things, but one of them is blinking. And
Hmm.
what we seem to find there is uh, so this is a live, so it's not with video now, it's the live with the mother and the infant. And when we look at phrase boundaries in the singing, the mothers actually tend to blink less. So in adults tend to blink at phrase boundaries, but the mothers are doing the opposite. And the infants seem to show a different pattern. So we're following up on that. But I think you're absolutely right that all of these modalities are interconnected, and they all have temporal structure
Mhm.
implications that haven't been explored enough.
Cool. Thank you. It's great.
Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Uh, that's a question I always forget to ask from you. Uh, it's about your six position bistable rhythm. Uh, most studies find that children are not able to have the two uh, versions or switch between them until about 4 or 5 years. So how do we reconcile that with what you found, which seems to be that it's already present, even premature, reborn babies?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't know, but I can speculate. So, I mean, first of all, the measures that we're using are mostly EEG, and I don't know that that's been done in the children. I think it's more behavioral, but correct me if I'm wrong. But the other thing is that infants actually, in terms of rhythm, rhythmic structure, infants do things that their parents can't do. So, just like in language, they discriminate different speech sounds that are not in the language that they're learning. And they discriminate those in infancy, but they lose that ability by, well, before the end of the first year after birth. Um, so they can discriminate things their parents can't. Erin Hannon has shown this for rhythms that infants can actually um, do better at perceiving structures that are in groups of 7 beats than their parents. And they lose that by the end of around the end of the first year. So there seems to be this idea that it's a very general, like across vision and audition and probably other modalities, that infants come into the world with fewer biases so that they're able to learn any musical structure or they're able to learn any language. But with experience, they become specialized, so they become good, which is they have to become good at the language they're learning, the musical structures in their environment. And they also become worse at one's structures that are not in their environment. So it's quite possible that babies might be better at some of these more complex rhythms, like 3 is more complex than 2. And if you look at Western music, especially music for kids, what they're exposed to a lot, it's almost always in 2s or 4s. It's even 3s are rare, and any other meter is really rare. But if you look, you can go on YouTube now and look. Um, there's all these um, videos of kids in other cultures where they have complex rhythms that are doing like amazing things at age 2, tapping these complex drum patterns and so on. And it's unclear to me because nobody sort of systematically looked, but so it's unclear to me whether these are exceptional kids or whether just exposure to those rhythms in those cultures, they just do them. Whereas kids in Western culture tend to lose those abilities and then they have to regain them later if they want to be able to do, complex uh, rhythm processing.
So essentially, uh, either we cannot ask it in the right way, so they would know even before 5 years. We just are not able to ask them in the right way. Although there were some EEG studies in 4 or 5 years olds, and there is something, but not very convincing. Or you would think about the U-shaped kind of thing that maybe at 2, 3 years old, they are not able to do that, but then it resurfaces at about 5. Will be interesting to find.
Yeah, you should do that.
Well, we are not very much into children. You are very much more into that.
No, I think
Okay.
it's
Anyway, thanks.
a very interesting question.
I think there is time for one more question, even though there is a request to briefly discuss the eye tracking study, but let me go through the question first. Hi, thank you for the presentation. Are there any studies linking rhythm perception in infants and speech in noise recognition later in childhood?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I can't off the top of my head think of one, but I'd be surprised if there is nothing. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry. I'm not very helpful. Maybe somebody else here knows the answer.
That's all right. Right. Are you, if Laurel is okay, I'm happy to stay a bit more, like, let's extend to 5 more minutes to briefly like discuss about the eye tracking study as requested. If not, we can follow up maybe in the future.
I mean, as you like, it's pilot data, but I'm happy to briefly show you.
Yeah, and we can also skip that part of the recording because it's still pilot. If you want, we can just discuss it here and not upload it later on.
So can you see?
Yes, we can see your screen. It's not full screen.
Oh, it's not? Oh, okay, let me
Yeah,
switch. Is that better?
yeah, it's better. Yeah.
Yeah, so like I said, adults tend to blink mostly at phrase boundaries and at moments when they're going to give up their speaking turn and somebody else can speak. It's sort of seems to be an unconscious cue that we use when interacting. Listeners also coordinate their blinks with those of other speakers. So we were asking, will blinks tend to occur at phrase boundaries in infant caregiver interactions? So we want to know, is this already in place, these cues already in place in infancy? And will they occur similarly in infant-directed singing and in infant-directed speech? Yeah, so this is the setup. We have the infant and the parent interacting, and we have an eye tracker on each of them. We're also video recording and other things, but
Good morning to you. Good morning to you. We're all in our places with bright shining faces. Good morning to you. Good morning to you. The more we get together to get.
okay, so that gives you an idea. This was done by Sarah Ripley in my lab. These are 4 to 5 month old infants at the moment. They do trials of where we ask them to sing to keep their baby happy, speak to keep their baby happy. And you notice that this is sort of the minimum separation we can get with the dual eye tracking. But in a way, it's an advantage because when they can touch the baby, then we have all kinds of problems with measurements. But also, when they're a little bit at a distance, they have to work harder to keep their baby happy. So it's in a way, giving us they're sort of exaggerated what they're going to do to interact with their baby. I went over that. Yeah, so here's the data. So this is combined across song and speech. This is the onset of strong beats, whether in the music or the speech, And this is the caregiver's propensity to blink at different points before and after the strong beats. And what you can see is there's a suppression, so the caregivers are less likely to blink at the phrase boundaries. In both, that's collapsed across song and speech. Infants are showing a different pattern. So what the caregivers sort of tend to do, just anecdotally, is they'll sing a phrase and then they'll widen their eyes, look at the baby as if it's a conversation and they're looking for a response. And so they don't blink because they're really focused on the baby's reaction. The babe, which is not what we tend to do with adults. The infants are blinking, they're suppressing their blink in between, and they maybe, this isn't yet significant with the pilot data we have, but they seem to be, if anything, increasing before or in anticipation of the strong beat. And then if we break it up into song and speech, you can see it's mostly driven by the song. And the speech, we're not so sure what's going on yet. We need to collect more data, but at least, it's not, I forget the number of infants in here, whether it's eight or something, but with a small number of infants, it's a pretty, looks like a pretty strong effect there. So with the infants, we can also break it up into song and speech. And again, they seem to be showing a somewhat different trajectory for the song and the speech. So as I mentioned, the song, they're sort of anticipating the onset of the strong beat. For speech, it seems, if anything, to be after. So anyway, that's just a very quick glimpse at what I hope when we get more data will be some interesting understanding of infant blinking.
We're certainly looking forward to the final results. Last comment here, could parents' blink suppression be about trying to keep the baby interested when they're not providing engaging input via singing?
I think so, yeah. I think that's a really good comment. And I think it's almost even more than just keeping them, like, I think they are keeping them engaged because they widen their eyes, they look at them. But it's almost like they're expecting a response. They're giving the infant a chance to respond. So they're focusing their attention. In conversations, the person that's talking tends not to look directly at the person they're talking to. They tend to sort of look away a bit. The person who's the listener tends to look at the person who's talking. So in adults, we have this kind of thing. I think it's quite different in the infants. So the parents are looking at them, inviting a response. Yeah, so I think that's at least part of what's going on. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I can see another hand. I'm afraid this needs to be the final one because I can see people leaving. So, Ezra?
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful, inspiring talk. I was wondering, in this last pilot study, would you think of including poetry? Because I always think that we are always doing the binary thing, speech versus music, but poetry is this interesting thing in between. And it would be quite interesting to see whether poetry would be more showing the pattern we see in music without the melodic, contour, I mean, the musical pattern in that sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in some sense, I think infant-directed speech is a little bit like poetry. So it may not rhyme like traditional poetry, but it has a lot of the sort of exaggerations and the rhythmic aspects and the contours, the pitch contours that you would get more in poetry than otherwise. So yeah, actually, I hadn't really thought about that before, but somebody should do an analysis comparing infant-directed speech and poetry, poetry reading, because I suspect that they would actually be a lot of similarities.
Great. I think that we all enjoyed this session. Laurel, you can see that in the comments. We would love to have you back in the future. So you will find Laurel's talk on YouTube shortly. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us, and thank you all of you for attending. I will see you again 28th of May in the upcoming Journal Club of May. Laurel, thank you again for being here.
Well, thanks everyone for your comments too. It was interesting.
Bye. See you soon.